Garage lights died all at once. Not a flicker. Not a warning. Just darkness, sudden and total, swallowing every corner of the underground level beneath Marlowe Infrastructure's headquarters. Tessa Marlowe froze between two parked cars, her keys in her hand, her phone in her bag, her heart already climbing into her throat before her mind caught up with what her body already understood. She was not alone down here, and whatever was about to happen had been planned long before she walked through that stairwell door. If you've never seen this channel before, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like if you want more, and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. You are going to want to see how this one ends. The board meeting had run 43 minutes over schedule, which meant Tessa Marlowe was the last person still in the building who wasn't paid to be there after 9 o'clock. She noticed that fact somewhere around the 18th floor, standing in an elevator that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air, watching the numbers descend. She noticed it the way she noticed most things quickly, filed away, then set aside in favor of whatever problem was more immediately demanding her attention. Tonight, that problem was a stack of audit documents sitting in her laptop bag and a board that had spent the better part of an hour pretending they were asking questions when they were really issuing warnings. The numbers aren't adding up, Tessa. We need this resolved before the quarter closes. You understand what we're saying. She understood exactly what they were saying. She'd understood since the first time she'd pulled up the redevelopment fund projections 3 weeks ago and found a number that didn't match anything she could account for. Then she'd found another, and another. And by the time she'd traced the discrepancy backward through 4 layers of subcontractor invoicing, she wasn't looking at accounting errors anymore. She was looking at something deliberate, something patient, and something that had been running for long enough that whoever was behind it felt entirely comfortable with it. Told 3 people. Only 3. She was still thinking about that, about the exact expressions on each of those 3 faces, when she'd briefed them on what she'd found when the elevator doors opened and she stepped into the underground parking structure. It was the kind of space that made you conscious of your footsteps. Low ceilings, exposed concrete, sodium lights strung at intervals that left too much shadow between each pool of yellow. Tessa had parked on level B, far end, near the service corridor, a habit she'd developed years ago, when this building was still under construction and she'd worked late enough that every other spot near the elevator was already gone. Now the company owned the whole building, and she still parked in the same corner, partly out of routine and partly because she didn't like being watched walking to her car. She shifted her laptop bag to her left shoulder and started across the garage. It was almost empty at this hour. 2 cars she recognized Legal's associate who always burned midnight oil before a filing deadline, and the black sedan belonging to building security that never seemed to move. Then near the far exit, a white panel van she didn't recognize, parked at an angle that partially blocked the lane. She registered it, kept walking. Across the space, maybe 40 feet to her left, she caught movement. A man in a gray maintenance uniform was crouched beside an electrical panel near the service corridor entrance, working by the light of a headlamp clipped to his collar. He didn't look up. She knew who he was in the abstract way that building occupants know the people who keep the building running. She'd seen him in passing. Knew his name was Reid something. Knew he worked nights. Knew he had a kid because someone in HR had mentioned it once in the context of the company's flexible scheduling policy. She didn't think about him for more than half a second. She was looking at the van again. There was something off about it that she couldn't immediately name. It was the right kind of anonymous commercial plates, no markings, the sort of vehicle that belongs in a parking garage without calling attention to itself. But it was parked badly. Not the casual badly of someone in a hurry, but the specific badly of someone who needed to block something without making it look intentional. It was blocking the exit ramp. Tessa slowed. Not fully, just a fraction. The way you slow when something doesn't add up, but you haven't decided yet whether it matters. That's when she noticed the camera. The security camera mounted to the column nearest the elevator bank was pointed wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not like someone had ripped it sideways, but slightly, maybe 15 degrees off its normal sweep. The kind of adjustment that would look like nothing to anyone not specifically looking for it. Pace slowed another fraction. Two men near the far wall, close to where her SUV was parked. They were standing beside a car that wasn't theirs. She could tell by the way they were standing. Neither of them with keys in hand, neither of them moving toward it or away from it. Just standing, waiting for something, or for her to get close enough. Tessa's hand went to her bag. Her phone was in the outer pocket. She needed maybe 8 seconds to get it out, unlock it, dial. The lights went out, not slowly, not one section at a time. All of them, all at once, and the darkness was so complete and so sudden that her spatial memory immediately scrambled. She knew where the walls were, her car was, where the van was, but in the first half-second of total black, her body didn't trust that knowledge, and she stopped moving entirely, which was the wrong thing to do, and she knew it even as she did it. She heard footsteps, more than one set, coming from the direction of the two men. She reached for her bag. A hand closed on her upper arm, not rough, not violent, but firm in a way that communicated authority with no room for argument, and a voice came from directly behind her left shoulder, low and close. "Stay behind me." She didn't scream. Later she would wonder why her instinct was to comply rather than fight, and the answer she kept coming back to was that the voice didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact, like someone reporting the current weather conditions. She stepped back. The hand released her arm, and the man, the maintenance worker, Reid, she realized, recognizing the gray uniform even in the dark, moved past her. He moved quietly for a man his size, which she registered in that first disoriented moment without quite processing what it meant. He placed himself between her and the sound of the footsteps with the kind of economy that didn't look like bravery. It looked like math. "There's a service door 12 feet to your right," he said, and his voice was still at that same controlled volume. Not whispering Carrie's just contained. "Wall is concrete. Keep your hand on it and move toward it now." "There are two of them," she said. She didn't know why she said it. Clearly already knew. "Three," he said. "One near the van." She found the wall with her palm and started moving. Behind her, she heard the footsteps stop. Then a voice, male, flat, not local, said something she didn't catch, and there was a pause that had a particular quality to it. The kind of pause that happens when someone has encountered a situation that wasn't in their original plan. Reid didn't say anything. She heard the scuff of a shoe. Then something that wasn't quite a struggle and wasn't quite not one fast, efficient, the sound of a situation being resolved rather than a fight being had, and then Reid was beside her again. "Keep moving." "What did you service door now?" She found it. The handle was a push bar, cold metal, and she shoved through it and into a narrow corridor lit by a single emergency strip along the floor, just enough to see by, just enough to move. Reid came through behind her and pulled the door shut. He wasn't breathing hard. That was the thing that kept catching her attention. She was breathing like she'd run up 10 flights of stairs, and he looked like he'd just checked a fuse box. "Where does this go?" she asked. "Loading dock, north side." He was already moving. Not running makes noise, but covering ground at a pace she had to work to match. "There's a freight elevator at the end. We take it to 3, cross to the main stairwell on the west side, exit onto Michigan Avenue." "My car, leave it. My laptop bag has—" "I know." He glanced at her. "You mentioned the audit documents in the board meeting." She stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "Sound carries through HVAC returns on the 16th floor, he said, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "I was servicing the intake unit outside the conference room." She didn't know how to respond to that. She filed it. The corridor turned left, and they followed it, past stacked pallets, and a water heater, and a rack of spare fluorescent tubes. Somewhere above them, she heard the emergency alarm. She hadn't noticed him trigger a low, building-wide pulse that would bring security and then police, and would also, she understood, push anyone in the garage toward the main exits and away from where they were. "You triggered that," she said, "when I passed the panel." He said it like it was obvious, which it was, in retrospect. They reached the freight elevator. He held the doors, and she stepped in, and he followed, and in the small enclosed space, the silence between them had a different texture. She looked at him directly for probably the first time. He was lean rather than bulky, mid-30s, dark-eyed, with the kind of stillness in his face that didn't read as calm so much as deliberate. like someone who'd made a decision a long time ago to keep everything that was happening inside him from appearing on the surface. There was a long scratch on the back of his left hand. New. She hadn't seen him get it. "You're going to have to tell me who you are," she said. "Reid Carver. I fix things in your building." "That's not what I mean." He looked at the elevator doors. "I know what you mean." The elevator reached the 3rd floor and the doors opened. Stepped out first, checked the corridor, stepped back and held the doors. Clear. They moved through the building, up 2 more flights, out through the west stairwell, and into the cold air on Michigan Avenue. January in Chicago at 9:30 at night, the sidewalk was thin with foot traffic, whined off the lake cutting straight through her jacket. She stood there for a moment, her laptop bag still on her shoulder, her keys still in her coat pocket, breathing real air, and let the shaking in her hands run its course. Reid stood a few feet away, scanning the street with the same methodical patience he'd used in the garage. "The men," she said. "Do you know who they were?" "No. But you have a guess." He didn't answer immediately. A cab passed. A couple walked by, heads down against the wind, not noticing them. "Someone wanted you scared enough to hand something over," he said finally. "They knew which garage level. They knew your car. They had access to the camera controls." "It's not a robbery." "No," she said, "it's not." Called the police. While they waited, she called her head of security, who sounded genuinely rattled, which told her something she didn't entirely like. She called her assistant and told him to cancel her morning schedule without explaining why. Stood on that sidewalk in the January wind and did the things that needed doing, and the whole time Reid stood nearby, not hovering, not inserting himself, just present. The police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 officers first, then a detective named Brower who asked questions with the professional skepticism of someone who assumed the most complicated explanation was usually the wrong one. Tessa answered everything precisely. Reid answered fewer questions more briefly. The detective spent a while looking at him in a way that had something searching in it. When Brower stepped away to make a call, Tessa turned to Reid. "You need to give me a real answer," she said. "Who are you, not your job title?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just weighing something. "Former Navy SEAL," he said, "separated 4 years ago. I took the maintenance job because it had overnight hours, and I could be home when my daughter got off the school bus." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole story." She looked at him for a long moment. "How old is she?" 9. "Does she know about—" Tessa gestured vaguely at the night, at the garage behind them, at whatever he had done in the dark. "She knows I can fix things," he said. "That's enough." Tessa nodded once. They went back to giving statements, and the police found 2 men, matching descriptions 2 blocks north, attempting to load equipment into the white van before realizing it was already surrounded. The 3rd was gone. The van had false plates. The cameras on level B had been manually repositioned sometime in the previous 2 hours, and the lighting grid had been cut from a secondary panel inside the building. From inside, the detective shared that last piece quietly, off to the side, and watched Tessa's face while he said it. "Someone with building access," Brower said. "Knew the systems." "Yes," Tessa said. "Any idea who might want to—" "I have several ideas," she said. "None of them are guesses." Brower studied her. "You're not surprised."
"I'm working on a problem,"
she said. "Tonight was someone trying to make that problem go away before I could solve it." She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. They exchanged cards, and she was told not to leave the city, which she found faintly insulting. And then it was over, or the official part of it was over. Reid was leaning against the building facade 20 feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, waiting for nothing in particular. She walked over. "Go home," she said. "Go home to your daughter." "My shift isn't— I'll cover it." She paused. "You probably saved my life tonight." He shook his head, not dismissively but precisely. "I got you out of a garage, Reid." He looked at her. "Someone inside this building helped them," she said. "That means tomorrow, when you walk back in there, some of the people you work with every day are not who you think they are." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not new information," he said. "Not for me." She understood what he meant. She didn't say so. "Be careful," she said instead. He nodded once, pulled his collar up against the wind, and walked toward the parking structure exit, where his truck was on the street level. She watched him go and thought about the moment in the dark when he'd appeared beside her, not out of nowhere. She understood now, because he'd been watching something she hadn't noticed, and he'd moved before she'd even registered that she should be afraid. The thing that stayed with her wasn't that he'd been fast, or that he'd been quiet, or that he'd gotten them out, without either of them getting seriously hurt. The thing that stayed with her was that when he'd said, "Stay behind me," there hadn't been a single fraction of a second where she'd considered doing anything else. She'd spent 10 years building a company. She trusted her instincts almost exclusively. And in that first moment in total darkness, her instincts had told her to trust a man she barely knew without hesitation. She was still thinking about why that was when her phone rang. It was Graham Valor, Tessa. His voice was warm with concern, exactly the way it always was. "I just heard. Are you all right? Tell me where you are, and I'll come to you." She stood on the sidewalk and listened to the city and felt something she'd chosen not to feel for the past 3 weeks settle into something colder and more certain. "I'm fine, Graham," she said. "Thank you for calling." "Of course. You're sure you're safe?" "Completely," she said. "Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." She ended the call. She stood with the phone in her hand, and the wind coming off the lake, and the knowledge that only 3 people had known about the documents, and one of them had just called her within minutes of an incident that hadn't yet been publicly reported. Tomorrow would be complicated. Tonight, she was standing on a sidewalk in January, and she was still standing, and the quiet man who fixed things in her building had seen something in a dark garage that she hadn't, and moved before she could. She thought that deserved more than a thank you. She just didn't know what yet. The call from Graham Valor stayed with Tessa longer than she wanted it to. She replayed it in the car on the way home. Her assistant had arranged a car service because her SUV was still in the garage, now technically part of a police scene, sitting in the back seat with her laptop bag across her knees and the city moving past the windows in wet amber streaks. Graham had called within 9 minutes of the incident. She'd checked the timestamp twice. The police report hadn't been filed yet. Nothing had gone out on any newswire. Her own security team hadn't been formally notified through official channels until she'd made the call herself, standing on Michigan Avenue in the cold. 9 minutes. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. By 6 in the morning, she was at her kitchen table, with coffee she'd made too strong, and the financial files she'd printed 3 weeks ago spread across the surface in the order she'd first encountered them. She went through them again, not because she expected to find something new, but because she needed to be certain, absolutely, inarguably certain before she did what she was considering doing next. The numbers hadn't changed. The pattern hadn't changed. 4 layers of subcontractor invoicing, 9-figure redevelopment contract, and somewhere between the second and third layer, money was leaving the project and not arriving anywhere it was supposed to arrive. Not all at once. Never in amounts large enough to trigger automated flags. Just steadily, patiently, across 14 months, the way a slow leak empties a tank. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got dressed and went to work. Reid Carver was already in the building when she arrived. She saw him from the lobby through the glass partition that separated the main entrance from the maintenance corridor, working on something near the elevator bank, with a socket wrench and the particular focused. Quiet that seemed to be his natural operating mode. He'd apparently gone home, slept at least a few hours, and come back. His shift didn't start until noon. She pushed through the partition door. "You didn't have to come in early," she said. He glanced up. Elevator 3's been running slow for a week. Figured I'd get ahead of it. "Reid, it needed doing." She stood there for a moment.
Is your daughter at school?
"Bus picks her up at 7:40. He set the wrench down. "She made me a sandwich this morning. Ham and mustard. She's been doing that since she was 7. Decided I couldn't feed myself properly." There was something in the way he said it that was entirely unguarded, which felt like a different person from the man in the garage the night before. Not a different person, she corrected herself. Just a different room of the same person. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. Last night, the way you moved, the way you knew where they were before they were anywhere near us, how long had you been watching?" He considered that. Not evasive, just honest about needing a second to find the precise answer. "I noticed the van when I came on shift at 8. Plates didn't match the vehicle registration style for Illinois commercial. The font spacing was wrong." Then I saw one of them walk through the garage twice without going to a car. That was about 8:15. He paused. When the board meeting ran long, I moved to a position where I could see the elevator. You were watching for me. I was watching a situation that was developing, he said. You happened to be the target. That's a careful way to put it. It's an accurate way. She looked at him for a moment. The police are going to want a follow-up statement from you today. Detective Brower. I know, he already texted. She nodded. Started to leave, then stopped. The camera, the one that was repositioned, did you notice that before the lights went out? That was the third thing I noticed, he said. After the van and the man who didn't have a car. She filed that. Thank you, she said, for last night. For this morning. For all of it. You don't need to keep thanking me. I know I don't need to, she said. I want to. She left him with the elevator and took the stairs. The story broke before 10 o'clock. Someone had talked, she didn't know who yet. Though she had a list of candidates, and by mid-morning the news cycle had picked up the basic outline. Attempted attack on the CEO of Marlowe Infrastructure in the building's underground parking structure. One suspect apprehended, 2 at large, investigation ongoing. The coverage was factual and thin, because the facts that were public were factual and thin. But the accompanying detail that gave the story traction was the employee who'd intervened. A maintenance worker. Former military, single father. Tessa saw the first piece at 9:53 and felt something sink in her chest, not for herself but for Reid, because she knew immediately what it meant, and she doubted very much that he would welcome it. She was right. By 11 o'clock, 3 different employees had separately knocked on his maintenance office door to tell him they'd seen the coverage. By noon, someone in communications had sent her a note, asking whether the company wanted to issue a statement acknowledging his role. By 12:30, a reporter from a local station had somehow gotten his cell number and left a voicemail. She found him in the basement mechanical room, eating his lunch, a ham and mustard sandwich. She noticed with his phone face down on the workbench beside him, and the expression of a man who had decided that if he ignored something long enough, it might reasonably leave him alone. They found you, she said. Apparently. I'm sorry. I don't know who. Doesn't matter who. He picked up the sandwich, put it down again. It's out there now. The company can help manage it. Control the narrative, limit. I don't want it managed, he said. He said it without heat, but there was something underneath it that was firm in a way that didn't leave much room for negotiation. I want it to stop. I did my job last night. That's it. I'm not a story. Tessa sat down on the edge of the workbench across from him. It was not a thing. She typically did sit on workbenches in basement mechanical rooms during lunch, and the slight awkwardness of the position was probably visible, but she stayed anyway. You're going to be one regardless, she said as gently as she could. At least for a week or 2. I can't stop that, but I can make sure the framing is limited and that no one contacts you at home. He looked at her. My daughter is going to hear about this. Yes, she doesn't know. What specifically doesn't she know? That I did things in the military. That he stopped. Picked up the sandwich again, not to eat, just to have something in his hands. She knows I was a SEAL. She's proud of that in the way kids are proud of things they half understand. What she doesn't know is the specific content of what that means. What I was trained for. What I actually did. And you're worried that this will mean... She's 9, he said. She made me a ham sandwich this morning. I'd like to keep those 2 things in the same world for as long as possible. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Outside the mechanical room, the building hummed around them, the vast, indifferent infrastructure of a working office tower, pipes and circuits, and the low vibration of machines doing what they were designed to do. How long has it been? She asked. Since you left. 4 years in March. And before that, 12 years in. 3 deployments, he paused. My wife died in the 3rd year after I got out. Aneurysm. 31 years old. No warning. He said it the way people say things they've said many times before, not without feeling, but with the feeling worn smooth by repetition, shaped into something survivable. After that, it was just me and Piper. I'm sorry, Tessa said. Yeah. He set the sandwich down. She's the reason I took the night shift. I didn't want to be in security or contracting, anything that looked like what I used to do, because I was afraid of. He stopped again. Seemed to make a decision about how much of the sentence to finish. I was afraid of sliding back into it, the mindset. The way it makes you see everything as a problem that needs solving by the most efficient available method. That's not a good way to raise a kid. But you slid back into it last night, she said. Not an accusation, an observation. No, he said. Last night I used a specific set of skills to get two people out of a dangerous situation. That's different from the mindset. He looked at her steadily. The mindset is when it becomes the first tool you reach for. Last night it was the only tool available. She understood the distinction. She thought it probably took years to understand it that clearly. Piper's bus gets her home at 3:15, she said. You should be there. I have a shift, Reid. She looked at him. Go home. Be there when she gets off the bus. I'll authorize the time. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name, not gratitude exactly. More like recognition, like a man seeing something he hadn't expected to find. All right, he said. Detective Brower came by the office at 2 o'clock with a colleague and a set of questions that had gotten more specific overnight. The two men apprehended near the van had lawyered up immediately and said nothing useful, but forensics had pulled partial prints from the repositioned camera and from the secondary electrical panel used to kill the lights. Prints from the camera matched a man with a prior arrest in Ohio for aggravated assault. The prints from the panel didn't match anyone on file. But the panel itself was significant. It was a non-obvious access point behind a locked door in a utility corridor that most building occupants wouldn't know existed. It's on the maintenance schematic, Brower said. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of someone who had stopped being impressed by complexity a long time ago. We think whoever accessed it had either been given the schematic or had time to study the building's systems in some detail beforehand. Or worked in the building, Tessa said. Or worked in the building, Brower agreed. He watched her carefully when he said the next part. We've identified that the security camera was repositioned using an administrative override code. Code belongs to your system. Who has access to that code? We're working on that list. Your IT security team is cooperating. He paused. Ms. Marlowe, I want to ask you directly, is there anything happening inside your company that someone might want to stop? Any investigation, any financial review, anything that would give an internal party a motive to? Yes, she said. Brower and his colleague exchanged a look. I'd like to share what I have with you, she said. But I need to do it in the right sequence. There are people I need to be certain about before I name them, because once I name them, the situation will accelerate and I need to be in a position to respond to that. How long do you need? 72 hours. Brower chewed on that. I can give you 48, he said. After that, if we develop leads through our own investigation that point in a specific direction, I follow those leads regardless of where you are in your process. That's fair, she said. After he left, she sat alone in her office for 20 minutes and looked out at the city and thought about the 3 people she'd told about the documents. She thought about Graham Valor calling 9 minutes after the incident. She thought about the administrative override code and who would have had natural access to it. She thought about 14 months and careful, patient theft, and a man who had been her mentor for 11 years and who had, in every external observable way, been exactly what he appeared to be. And she thought about the fact that appearing exactly as you're supposed to appear is a skill. She knew that better than most. She'd built an entire company on the ability to be exactly what a room full of investors needed to see, while managing, internally, the full complicated reality of what was actually happening. It wasn't deception. It was discipline. But discipline could be turned to different purposes. She opened her laptop and started building the sequence of documents she'd need for the next 48 hours. Reid, meanwhile, was home by 3 o'clock. Piper's bus was 4 minutes late, which he tracked from the front window of their rented house in Bridgeport, standing with a cup of reheated coffee that had gone cold again while he watched the street. The house was not large. It had 3 bedrooms, which was 2 more than they strictly needed, and a kitchen that had a slow leak under the sink he kept meaning to fix, and a backyard with a single oak tree that Piper had decided, 2 years ago, was a good climbing tree. Which it was, though he'd spent 6 months being tense every time she was in it, before eventually deciding that the risk was acceptable, and that some things were worth the worry. The bus pulled up, and she came down the steps with her backpack hanging off one shoulder at the angle that meant she'd had a good day and hadn't bothered to straighten it out. And when she saw him standing in the window, she waved with both arms, like he was standing a quarter-mile away instead of 40 feet. She was in the door 30 seconds later, dropping her backpack on the hall floor in defiance of every conversation they'd had about where backpacks were supposed to go, and she was already talking before she had her shoes off. Mia said her mom saw something on the news about our building, she said. She said there was a thing in the parking garage. She said someone who works there helped a lady. She looked up at him. Was that you? He'd prepared for this. He'd spent the drive home thinking through exactly how to say it. Yeah, he said. That was me. Were you in danger? Not really, he said, which was approximately true. Did you fight somebody? I got someone out of a bad situation. It wasn't a fight. Also approximately true. Piper considered this with the focused gravity that 9-year-olds bring to information they're deciding how to categorize. Mia's mom said you were a soldier. I was in the Navy. A long time ago. Before me? Before you and for a few years after, and then I wasn't anymore. He paused. You know this, Piper. We've talked about it. Yeah, but Mia's mom made it sound like. She trailed off, apparently finding the precise word. Like it was a big deal. It's not a big deal, he said. I helped someone. That's what you do when you can. She looked at him for a moment with her mother's eyes dark and direct and extremely difficult to deflect once they'd focused on something, and then apparently decided to accept this version of events. Okay, she said. Can we have pasta for dinner? The kind with the butter and the cheese, not the sauce. Yeah, he said. We can have that. Do you know how to make it? I make it every time you ask for it. You burn the butter sometimes. I don't always burn the butter. Most times, she said, and picked up her backpack from the floor and went upstairs, which was more than she usually managed. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of her moving around above him, and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anything else he had a clean word for. Just the specific physical sensation of a thing that mattered being still intact. He made the pasta. He only slightly burned the butter. The next 2 days inside Marlowe infrastructure were quiet in the way that things are quiet when a great deal of pressure is building somewhere out of sight. Reid returned to his regular schedule and noticed things with the patient attention he'd always applied to it. But now the things he noticed had different weight. Conversation that stopped when he rounded a corner. An executive assistant who seemed to be going through a hard drive with unusual urgency. A meeting that didn't appear on any calendar, held in a conference room that someone had booked under a facilities maintenance placeholder. He didn't act on any of it. He made notes. He filed them. On the second afternoon, Tessa stopped by the maintenance office. She didn't sit down this time. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been running on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee for 2 days and was keeping the exhaustion from the surface by sheer organizational force. I need to know something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly, not protectively. All right, the men in the garage. The one who came closest to reaching me, the one you disarmed near the loading dock. She paused. What would have happened if you hadn't been there? He thought about it for a real second, not to protect her from the answer, but to make sure the answer was accurate. They had zip ties, he said. Sedative I found a used ampule when I went back with the police. They wanted you mobile and compliant, not hurt, but they were prepared to hurt you if that's what it took to get compliance. She nodded slowly. Graham is moving faster than I anticipated, she said. It was the first time she'd said the name directly to him. He'd suspected it the geometry of who had access, who had motive, who had called 9 minutes after, but hearing it said plainly changed something in the air. How much faster, he asked. The audit is being moved up by the external firm. Someone made a call to push the timeline. She looked at him. That was supposed to be an internal decision only 3 people knew about. And you didn't make that call. No. He was quiet for a moment. He's trying to control the pace. If the audit runs before he's had time to restructure the paper trail, then everything I've already found becomes corroborated by an independent third party, she finished. Can't discredit it. He can't say I manufactured it for political reasons or because I wanted him out. It becomes a straightforward matter of documented evidence. So he needs to move before that happens, yes. How long? The gala is in 9 days, she said. Annual charity event, the whole company, outside guests. It's the biggest gathering of the year. She paused. Graham is the chair of the organizing committee. Reid looked at her steadily. You think he'll use it? I think if I were someone trying to make a significant problem disappear in the next 9 days, and I had access to the logistics of a large-scale event involving controlled building systems and 1,000 people moving through predictable spaces. She stopped. Yes, I think he'll use it. Reid thought about this. He thought about Piper and the oak tree and the ham sandwich wrapped in foil on his workbench. He thought about the specific decision he'd made 4 years ago to be a man who fixed broken things in a building, and the reason he'd made that decision. If you're telling me this, he said, you're asking me something. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't choose to do, she said. I want to be precise about that. What happened in the garage, you made a split-second call in an emergency, and I'm not going to pretend I don't owe you a great deal for it. But this is different. This is me telling you that something is probably coming, and that I trust you with that information. Why? She seemed to find the question direct enough to deserve a direct answer. Because you noticed the van, she said, and the camera. And the man who didn't have a car. You were watching a situation develop before I walked into it. It's not something I can train into a security team in 9 days. She paused. And because you went home and made your daughter dinner, and that matters to me, though I couldn't entirely explain why. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to be a SEAL again, she said. I wouldn't ask that. Then what are you asking? Keep watching, she said, the way you were already watching. He looked at her for a long moment. The building hummed around them. Somewhere above, the elevator he'd serviced that morning ran smoothly and quietly between floors, the way it was supposed to. All right, he said. She nodded once and left. He sat alone in the maintenance office and thought about what watching carefully had already cost him, and what it might cost next, and whether the difference between who he'd been and who he was trying to be was as clear as he'd spent 4 years believing it was. He didn't come to a conclusion. He rarely did on the things that mattered. He just knew that he'd said all right, and that he'd meant it, and that somewhere in a building above him, a woman was rebuilding a case against someone she had trusted for 11 years, and doing it alone, and that this was the kind of problem that didn't resolve itself through patience alone. Some things, eventually, you had to move toward. He didn't know yet exactly what that would look like. He knew it was coming. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. The 9 days moved the way time moves when you're waiting for something you can't fully prepare for too fast in the hours you could use and too slow in the ones you couldn't. Reid kept watching. He'd always been a noticer, even before the Navy, even before anyone had taken that quality and trained it into something with edges and applications. Growing up, he'd been the kid who knew which teacher was in a bad mood before she said a word, who knew which hallway to avoid on which afternoon, who knew when a house was quiet in the wrong way. The military had given that instinct a framework, a vocabulary, a set of protocols for converting observation into action. But the raw material had always been there. It was just part of how his brain processed the world. So he watched. He watched the way Graham Valor moved through the building, in the 7 days leading up to the gala. Graham was 61, a trim and careful man with silver hair and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades learning to make people feel heard. He was good at it, genuinely good, not obviously performative. Tessa had told Reid once, not in so many words, but in the way she'd described their professional history, that Graham had been the person who believed in her early, who'd helped her navigate the particular obstacles that stood between a 30-year-old woman with a plan, and the investors needed to make that plan real. That history was real. The gratitude she'd felt was real. That was what made the thing he'd been doing for 14 months something more than a financial crime. It was a specific kind of betrayal, the kind that works because it wears the face of someone you trusted when you didn't know enough to be careful. Reid noticed that Graham spent more time than usual in the building operations office on level B. He noticed that Graham had 3 separate conversations with the external events coordinator for the gala, not unusual given his role as committee chair. But the conversations happened in stairwells and a parking structure, and once in a supply corridor rather than any of the conference rooms where they should naturally have taken place. He noticed that Graham's personal assistant, a young man named Corey, who was good at his job and didn't seem to know what he was working adjacent to, had been tasked with pulling the building's emergency evacuation schematics under the pretext of updating the gala's safety documentation. He noted all of it. He gave none of it to anyone but Tessa, and he gave it to her in the brief, precise way he gave any information facts, sequence, no editorializing. He pulled the evacuation schematics, she said when he told her. They were in the stairwell off the 14th floor, which had become, without either of them formally deciding this, the place they spoke when what they needed to say wasn't for anyone else. It was private by virtue of inconvenience. Nobody used that stairwell unless the elevator was slow. Through Corey, Reid said. Corey doesn't know what he requested or why. He just pulled what he was asked. Graham knows the building, Tessa said. He's been here since the beginning. He doesn't need the schematics for safety documentation. No, he needs them to know how people will move, she said. There's a disruption, where the bottlenecks are, where someone could be separated from a group. She said it flatly, like reading a weather report. Reid had noticed she did this when something was frightening. Her went very flat and precise, like narrowing the bandwidth so nothing leaked. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. How many people does he have inside the building, beyond the garage incident? I count 2 certainties and 1 probable, Reid said. Kyle Marsh, in facilities, he's the one who would have had access to the electrical systems for the garage. Marsh has been taking calls on a personal phone during work hours with a frequency that's outside his normal pattern. The second is someone in it. I don't have a name yet, but the administrative override code for the cameras came from a terminal on the IT floor, and I've been watching who has consistent access to that terminal. He paused. Probable is a woman named Sandra in event logistics. She's been pulling gala access lists and cross-referencing them against floor maps. Sandra has been on my staff for 4 years, I know. Tessa looked at the stairwell wall. There was a scratch in the paint at eye level, a long diagonal line that looked like it had been made by a corner of something moved carelessly through the space. She stared at it for a moment. What are they planning to do at the gala? She asked. I don't know the specific mechanism, he said, but the pattern looks like a controlled disruption. Something that creates chaos and confusion in the building system's lighting. Maybe communications that provides cover to isolate you from your security team and create a window for leverage. The same thing they tried in the garage. Bigger, he said. With more people to generate confusion and more routes to exploit. He looked at her directly. Tessa, you have the documents. You have what you need for the police and the audit. You don't have to attend the gala. She looked at him. This is my company. I know. I built it from the first contract. I know every subcontractor on every project. I know the name of the woman who runs the coffee cart on level 3, and I know her daughter just started college. This is my building. She paused. I'm not hiding from Graham Valor in my own building. He'd expected this. He didn't argue with it. Then I need to know your plan. I give the evidence to Brower the morning of the gala, she said. Everything I've compiled. He'll have enough to move on Graham before the event even starts. And if Graham moves before morning, she was quiet. He's accelerating, Reid said. The schematics. The call he took yesterday that ran 40 minutes, I clocked it while I was servicing the HVAC unit on 7. He's not running on a 9-day timeline anymore. Something pushed it up. What pushed it up? She said, and it wasn't a question. The audit firm called your office 2 days ago to confirm the revised timeline, he said. Your assistant took the call. It went into the shared calendar. She closed her eyes briefly. Graham has access to the shared calendar. Yes. She opened her eyes. He knows the audit is in 4 days. Yes. The stairwell was very quiet. Above them, 14 floors of a working company moved through the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon, entirely unaware that the shape of the next 72 hours was being decided in a fire stairwell by a CEO and a maintenance supervisor who was more than that, had always been more than that, but had spent 4 years trying to convince himself otherwise. Move the evidence handoff, Reid said. Don't wait for morning of the gala. Call Brower today. If I call Brower today, Graham knows within hours. He has the IT access, he'll see the communication patterns. Then don't call from your office. Don't email. Go to Brower directly. She looked at him. He could see her running the sequence, checking it against what she knew about Graham's resources and reach, and the ways a careful man anticipates being cornered. If I go today, she said slowly, and Brower moves on Graham before the gala, what happens to the two people inside the building? Marsh and the IT contact. If Graham is detained, they know immediately. They run, Reid said. Or they go quiet and wait for instructions that won't come. Or they complete whatever they were tasked to do regardless, she said. As a contingency. That was the part he hadn't fully mapped. That's possible. Graham is organized, she said. He didn't run a 14-month diversion without contingencies. She paused. If I go to Brower today and Graham is taken in for questioning, even questioning, not arrest Marsh, and whoever's in IT will know the operation is compromised. And the gala is in 3 days. There will be 800 people in this building. Reid stood with that. She was right, and he didn't like that she was right. So you're going to the gala, he said. We need them to move when we're ready for them, she said. Not before. He looked at her for a long moment. She was 30 years old, and she was talking about drawing out a man who'd already sent people to sedate and take her from a parking garage. And she was doing it with the calm of someone who had accepted the full weight of the problem and was managing it rather than being managed by it. It wasn't recklessness. Recklessness had a particular careless quality he knew how to recognize. This was something else, the specific courage of a person who has decided that there is a thing worth doing and is going to do it even though it frightens them. He knew that courage. He'd lived inside it for 12 years. He'd also seen what it cost. I need access to the building's secondary control systems, he said. Not administrative, physical access. The panels that run the lighting grid and the emergency communication arrays. If they're planning a blackout, I need to be able to work around it. I'll get you the access. I need it before the gala. I need time to know those panels the way I know everything else in this building. You'll have it tomorrow morning. He nodded once. And I need you to stay with your security team all evening. Every moment. If something happens, any disruption, any alarm, any reason people start moving, you don't investigate it yourself. You don't follow anyone down a corridor alone. You tell me. How? He pulled a radio from his belt, a small secondary unit he'd been carrying for a week, tuned to a frequency separate from the building's standard maintenance channel. He held it out to her. She took it, turned it in her hand. It was worn, the kind of worn that comes from actual use rather than age. This is yours, she said. I have another one. She looked at him, and for a moment the flatness dropped, and something else was there, something that was tired and a little afraid and entirely unwilling to say so. Reid, if this goes wrong, it won't go entirely right either, he said. Things don't, but we'll be ready for more of it than they're expecting. She almost smiled. It was a small, complicated expression that had something grateful in it and something that was too tired for straightforward gratitude. That's not exactly reassuring. It's the honest version. I know, she said. That's why it almost is. She put the radio in her coat pocket and went back to work. The next 3 days had the feeling of a held breath. Reid spent the morning of the day before the gala in the building's mechanical basement, moving through the secondary control panels the way he moved through any new system slowly, methodically, building a map of how the pieces connected and where the failure points were. The main lighting grid ran through a distribution panel on level B that he already knew. The emergency array was split between 2 secondary units on levels 3 and 7, both accessible through utility corridors that most building occupants had never seen. Communication system had a physical relay on the roof. Spent 4 hours mapping it. Then he spent another 2 running scenarios in his head, the way he'd once run them before any operation, not to find a plan that had no risk, because no such plan existed, but to find the plan that gave you the best options when the thing that was supposed to work didn't. The gala fell on a Friday evening. It occupied the building's main event space on level 4, a large open-plan space normally used for company presentations, temporarily transformed with catered food and a live quartet, and the particular managed warmth of corporate socializing done at scale. 800 guests, including investors, civic officials, project partners, and enough media presence to make the event genuinely public. Graham arrived at 6:15, 45 minutes before the official start, and Reid tracked him from the moment he entered the building. He was dressed for the event in a dark suit, and he moved through the setup with the ease of a man who owned the room, stopping to speak to the caterers, checking in with the event staff, shaking hands with the security detail at the entrance. He looked entirely like what he was supposed to look like. Tessa arrived at 7 sharp, with her security team 2 men from an outside firm she'd brought in 3 days ago, people with no prior relationship with anyone in the building. She was in a deep green dress that had the quality of being both appropriate for the event and entirely practical if she needed to move quickly, and she'd worn flat shoes, which Reid noticed because it was the kind of decision a person makes when they are not fully expecting the evening to go as planned. She caught his eye across the lobby when she came in. He was in his work uniform, standing near the service corridor entrance with the unremarkable presence of a man who was supposed to be there. She didn't nod or acknowledge him in any visible way. Neither did he. They understood each other well enough by now that they didn't need to. For the first 90 minutes, nothing happened. The quartet played. Catered food was passed. Graham made the rounds with the practiced graciousness of a man at a function he'd organized. And Tessa made her rounds with the careful attentiveness of a CEO who needed to be present everywhere, while trusting no one who wasn't supposed to be trusted. Reid moved through the service corridors. He checked the panel on level B at 8:15. Unchanged. He checked the secondary arrays on 3 and 7. Unchanged. He went to the roof relay at 8:40 and checked that. On the way back down from the roof, he found Kyle Marsh. Marsh was in the stairwell on level 6, which was 1 floor above the event space and empty at this hour, except for the ambient noise floating up from below. He was not in his work uniform. He was in dark clothes, and he had a small toolkit open on the floor beside him, working on a secondary junction box mounted to the stairwell wall, a junction that Reid recognized ran directly to the level 4 communications relay. Marsh heard him on the stairs and stood up fast, which told Reid everything he needed to know about whether Marsh believed he was doing something that could withstand scrutiny. Carver, Marsh said. He was 38, a solid man, and the expression he put on was the expression of someone who has prepared a plausible story and is deciding whether now is the time to use it. Kyle, Reid said. They looked at each other for a moment across the width of the stairwell. I'm running a diagnostic on the... Don't, Reid said. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Marsh stopped. Put the tools down and step away from the panel, Reid said. I have authorization to. You have authorization from Graham Valor, Reid said, who is at this moment the subject of a police investigation that Tessa Marlowe initiated 4 days ago. Which means any authorization Graham gave you is not something you want to be standing next to right now. He paused. Kyle, I don't think you're a bad person. I think someone gave you a reason to do something you otherwise wouldn't, and I think you're standing in a stairwell on a Friday night wondering how you got here. Another pause. Walk away from the panel. Go home. Call a lawyer tonight, not in the morning. Marsh looked at him. Something moved across his face, not quite fear, not quite relief, the specific expression of a person whose decision has been made for them by the presence of someone who is not going to be moved. Picked up his toolkit. He left the stairwell. Reid pulled out his radio. Marsh just left level 6 stairwell heading down, he said quietly. He was at the level 4 communications relay. I'd say he got maybe 60% of the way through what he was trying to do. Tessa's voice came back, low and level, understood. Stay with your team. Graham's going to know within the next 10 minutes that his timeline is broken. There was a brief pause. He's heading toward the event coordinator. He's on his phone. Which direction from you? Across the room. Maybe 50 feet. Keep the room between you, Reid said. Don't let the distance close. He was already moving down the stairwell. What happened next took 11 minutes by Reid's count, though afterward it felt both longer and shorter than that the way time distorts when a series of things unfold simultaneously and you are tracking all of them. The building's main lighting grid dropped at 8:57. Not all of it, the emergency strips on the floor, stayed active, and the event space had battery-backed perimeter lighting that came on automatically, so it wasn't the full darkness of the garage. It was something more partial and more chaotic, a large space suddenly dim. 800 people startled, the quartet stopping mid-phrase, the rise of voices and the scrape of chairs. Reid was already on level 4 when it happened. He moved through the edge of the crowd, not fighting the movement of people, but using it. Threading through the gaps the way you learn to thread through things when you've spent years in situations where going around is slower than going through correctly. He had a single objective: find Tessa before anyone else did. Her security team, to their credit, had closed around her immediately when the lights dropped. He could see the shape of the cluster from 20 feet away, Tessa in green at the center, two men flanking her, all three moving toward the emergency exit that led to the main lobby. Correct instinct, wrong direction, because Graham was between them and the lobby. Reid saw him at the same moment Graham saw Tessa. Graham had someone with him, a man Reid hadn't identified previously, tall, in a service uniform that didn't match any of the catering company's staff, and they were positioned at the natural convergence point between the event space and the emergency corridor. Tessa's security team didn't see it yet. They were watching the crowd, not the specific positioning of two men near an exit. Reid cut left, came around the edge of the crowd, and put himself in the gap between Graham and Tessa's team 10 seconds before they would have walked into it. Graham stopped. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other across 8 feet of dim, crowded space. Around them, the noise of 800 confused people moved like weather. The quartet had started playing again, something soft and determinedly calming that nobody was listening to. "Reid," Graham said. He said it with the same warmth he said everything, which was impressive under the circumstances. "Mr. Valor," Reid said, "you need to step aside. Still warm. Still smooth. This is between Tessa and me. I just need 5 minutes with her." "That's not going to happen. You don't understand the full." "I understand it," Reid said. "I've understood it for 12 days. The garage was yours. The camera override was yours. Schematic pull was yours. Marsh in the stairwell was yours." He looked at him steadily. "You built this carefully, Graham, but you built it over 14 months in a building where someone was paying attention." Graham looked at him. Something shifted in his face. The warmth didn't disappear exactly, but something behind it changed, like a light source moving. "You're a maintenance man," he said, and this time it wasn't warm. "Mostly," Reid said. The man in the false uniform moved, and Reid moved with it, a single adjustment in position that changed the geometry of the situation enough that the movement stopped. It wasn't a threat. It was information. "I know where you're going before you get there." The man in the uniform apparently understood the information, because he stopped. Behind Reid, he could hear Tessa's security team redirecting, moving her left toward the main stage exit, which was what he needed them to do. He heard her voice on the radio, one word, "Clear?" "Clear," he said. "Go." Graham made one more attempt. "Reid." "I can make it worth your..." "No." Reid's said, simply and finally, the way you close a door. Graham looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then, in the particular way that men who have run out of moves accept that fact, he stood very still and said nothing. The building lights came back up at 9:04. 7 minutes of partial darkness, most of which had been spent by the building's guests, being ushered by staff toward the exits in an orderly fashion that would later be described in the event debrief as a reasonable response to an electrical fault. Detective Braubauer arrived at 9:22 with 2 unmarked cars and 4 officers, having received a call from Tessa Marlowe at 9:08, which was the call she'd held until she was in the lobby with her security team, and Reid's voice in her ear saying, "He's not moving. You're clear." Graham Valor was detained in the event space, still in his dark suit, sitting at a table near the stage with the composure of a man who has accepted that a thing is finished but has not yet decided what to do next. He asked for his lawyer before Brower finished the first sentence. The man in the false uniform was detained in the service corridor off level 4 by building security, which simplified things considerably. Kyle Marsh was picked up at his apartment at 10:45, still in his dark clothes, with his personal phone showing 17 outgoing calls in the previous 2 hours, none of which had been answered. Reid sat in the maintenance office on level B at 11:15. In the particular aftermath quiet that follows a thing that has been held at tension for a long time and then released. He'd given his statement to a junior detective, answered every question accurately and without elaboration, and then come down here because it was the place in the building where he could think without anyone asking him anything else. The door opened at 11:32. Tessa came in and sat on the edge of the workbench, the same spot she'd sat 11 days ago, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. She looked exhausted. The careful composure that she wore through the working day was still there but thinner, like a coat that's been through a long season. Her hair had come partly loose from whatever it had been in for the event, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. It's done, she said. The immediate part, he said. There's still the audit. The legal process, yes. She looked at her hands. Tonight is done. He nodded. You told Graham I'd been paying attention, she said. You said someone had been paying attention in this building for 12 days. Yes, but you were paying attention before the garage, she said. The van, the camera, the man without a car. You'd been watching the building before you were watching it for me. I watch every building I work in, he said. It's just what I do. She looked at him. Do you think that ever stops? He thought about the honest answer. I think it gets quieter, he said. With the right conditions. I think it doesn't have to run at full volume all the time. She nodded slowly. What are the right conditions? He considered that for longer than the question probably required, but it was a question worth being careful with. Not feeling like the only person watching, he said finally. She was quiet with that. Outside, the city was doing what it always did at midnight, not sleeping exactly, just shifting registers, the daytime noise replaced by a different kind. Somewhere above them, Brower was still working through witness accounts. Somewhere across Chicago, 3 lawyers were receiving calls they'd probably expected for a while. And in a house in Bridgeport, a 9-year-old was asleep, completely unaware that her father had just spent an evening in a dim and crowded room, putting himself between a threat and a person who mattered, and that afterward he'd sat in a basement office and been for just this moment entirely still. Go home, Tessa said quietly. Go be with your daughter. He looked at her. You should sleep too. I will, she said. Eventually, he stood, picked up his jacket from the hook behind the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, you held it together. All of it. The whole 12 days. Barely, she said. Barely counts, he said. He left her there, in the maintenance office, with the fluorescent hum and the stacked manuals and the smell of machine oil, and he walked through the building. He'd spent 4 years learning, and he drove home to Bridgeport. And when he opened the door of the house, the first thing he heard was the small sound of Piper breathing in her sleep through the baby monitor. He still kept, even though she was 9, and he'd been meaning to put it away for 2 years now. He stood in the hallway and listened to it. Then he went to the kitchen, looked at the sink, and finally fixed the slow leak under it. The sink stopped leaking. That was the first thing Reid noticed when he came downstairs the next morning, the absence of the slow drip he'd been hearing for 4 months. The one he'd cataloged alongside 100 other small maintenance failures in his own house that he'd been too busy or too tired or too carefully occupied with other things to fix. He stood in the kitchen in the gray January light and looked at the cabinet under the sink, which was now closed properly because nothing was swelling from moisture anymore, and felt something he couldn't immediately name. Not pride exactly. More like the mild surprise of realizing that a thing you've been living around for so long it became invisible was actually fixable all along. Piper came downstairs at 7:15 in her school clothes, with her hair half brushed, which was standard, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him standing in front of the sink with the particular suspicious attention of a child who has learned to read her parents' moods before she's had breakfast. You look weird, she said. Good morning to you too. Did something happen? I had a long night at work. He turned to the stove. Eggs? Did the thing happen? The bad thing from the news? He looked at her. She was watching him with that direct, unhurried focus that she'd had since she was 3 years old. The focus that made it very difficult to give her an answer that wasn't substantially true. There was a problem at the building last night, he said. It's been handled. Were you in danger? I was careful, he said, which was different from no, and she was old enough to know it. Quiet for a moment, leaning against the doorframe, and the morning light through the kitchen window fell across her in a way that caught him, briefly and unexpectedly. In the chest, the specific way she tilted her head was entirely her mother's, a gesture he hadn't consciously noticed in a year or more, and it arrived now without warning. Dad, she said. Yeah, are you okay? He looked at her for a moment. I'm okay, he said. I'm really okay. She appeared to run this through whatever internal system she used for evaluating his honesty, and apparently decided it passed. Okay, she said. Can I have toast instead of eggs? There's no time for eggs. There's always time for eggs. There isn't. The bus comes at 7:40. Bus comes at 7:42. I've timed it. That's a weird thing to have timed, she said, But she sat down at the kitchen table, and he made the eggs, and they ate together in the particular comfortable disorganization of a weekday morning, and neither of them said anything important for the rest of it, which was exactly what he needed. He drove her to the bus stop, because the temperature had dropped overnight and the sidewalks were icy, and he watched the bus pull away. And then he sat in the truck on the quiet Bridgeport Street for a few minutes before he drove back to work. The building had a different quality that morning. He noticed it the moment he came through the service entrance, a kind of held collective breath. The specific atmosphere of a workplace that has processed a significant event overnight and is now in the process of deciding what to do with the knowledge. People in the lobby spoke in lower voices than usual. The elevator conversations he caught in passing were careful, abbreviated. The usual morning routine had been interrupted and not yet fully resumed. Detective Brower was in the building by 9. He'd set up a temporary working space in one of the smaller conference rooms on level 8, and he'd brought 2 additional investigators. The interviews were voluntary, and the building's legal counsel had issued a memo about that before 8 o'clock, but the voluntary nature of the thing didn't do much to change the atmosphere. Tessa was in her office by 7:30. Reid knew because he'd seen the light in her corner office when he'd crossed the lobby. He didn't go up. There was nothing that needed saying immediately, and she needed the morning to manage what the morning required. He went to work. He had a fire suppression system on level 10 that had been flagging intermittent pressure drops for a week, and 3 lighting fixtures on level 2 that needed replacing, and the usual accumulated list of small things that a building generates continuously, and that he moved through with the steady, patient attention that had always suited him. The work grounded him. It always had the specific reliability of physical problems that had physical solutions, of systems that failed in diagnosable ways, and could be restored to function if you understood what you were looking at. Around 11 o'clock, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Carver," he said. "Mr. Carver, this is Daniel Rice. I'm a partner at Holt Rice Consulting. We handle strategic risk and executive security for Marlowe Infrastructure. I've been asked by Ms. Marlowe to reach out to you regarding a conversation she'd like to schedule at your earliest convenience." Reid was quiet for a moment, standing in the level 10 mechanical room with the fire suppression panel open in front of him. "Could have called me herself." A brief pause on the other end. "Yes, sir, I expect she could have. I imagine she asked me to reach out because the matter is professional in nature, and she wanted it handled through appropriate channels." He recognized what Tessa was doing. She was being careful with him, making sure whatever she was about to offer was framed in a way that gave him room to consider it as a professional proposition rather than something more complicated. It was a thoughtful gesture. It was also, he noted, slightly unnecessary, because he'd already had a sense of where this was heading. "When?" he said. "This afternoon, if you're available." 3 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said, and hung up. He spent the intervening hours finishing the fire suppression calibration, replacing the level 2 fixtures, and re-waterproofing a section of the roof access door that had been letting cold air seep through the frame for 2 winters. He ate his lunch in the maintenance office ham and mustard again. Piper had apparently decided this was now a permanent dietary arrangement, and he sat with his thoughts in the way. He sat with things that required decision, not forcing them, just letting them turn over at their own speed. The meeting was in a small conference room on level 12, not Tessa's main office, which he interpreted correctly as a choice to conduct it on neutral ground. Ress was there when he arrived, a compact, efficient man in his late 40s, with the manner of someone who charges by the hour and has made his peace with that, and Tessa was already seated at the table with a legal pad in front of her that had writing on it he couldn't read from the doorway. "Read," she said. "Sit wherever you like." He sat across from her. Rice took a seat at the end of the table with his own folder and the posture of someone prepared to speak only when spoken to, which was professionalism of a high order. Tessa looked at him with the directness she always brought to things that mattered. She was in a different kind of tired now than she'd been the night before, not the exhausted, stripped down tired of immediate aftermath, but the slower, longer tired of someone who has held a difficult thing in position for a long time and is now feeling the muscles where they'd been clenched. "Before I say anything official," she said, "I want to say something personal." "Okay," he said. "You could have walked away from this at any point in the last 12 days. Nothing in your job description required you to do any of what you did. You volunteered into a situation that was genuinely dangerous. You did it with full understanding of what it could cost you, and you managed it in a way that protected everyone in that building, including 800 people who don't know your name. She paused. I am not good at expressing gratitude. I've been told this. But I want to try to do it properly before we talk about anything else. He waited. Thank you, she said. Really, not for saving the company, or protecting the evidence, or any of the professional dimensions of it. For being a person I could trust in a situation where I didn't have many of those. She paused again. That's the personal part. He nodded once. You're welcome, he said, because it was true and didn't need more than that. She looked at the legal pad briefly. The professional part, she said. I want to create a new division within Marlowe Infrastructure. Emergency preparedness, physical security, crisis response. It would operate alongside the existing security team, but with a different mandate: proactive, systems-oriented, focused on threat identification before events, rather than response after them. She looked up. I want you to run it. He'd known it was coming, and it still landed in a specific way. He sat with it for a moment. What would that look like, practically, he said. Daytime hours primarily. There would be occasional evening requirements events, executive travel, things that come up, but the core schedule would be 8 to 5, 5 days. You'd have a small team to build, a budget to develop the systems you want, and full authority over your division's operational decisions. She paused. No one would override your security assessments. Not me, not the board. If you say there's a problem, we treat it as a problem. He looked at the table for a moment. I've spent 4 years deliberately staying away from this kind of work, he said. There were reasons for that. I know, she said. You told me some of them. The concern was that I'd become the person I was trained to be, and that person is not bad, but not entirely suited to raising a 9-year-old. He looked at her. Still a concern. I understand that, she said. But Reid, what you did in the last 12 days wasn't that person. You didn't use force until there was no alternative, and when you had the alternative of pursuing Graham's accomplice at the gala, you didn't take it. You stayed with the mission. She paused. The person you're worried about becoming doesn't make that choice. You did. He sat with that. Piper would have dinner with you every night, she said quietly. That's not a selling point I'm adding for effect. It's something I thought about before I framed this. You took the night shift because you wanted to be home when she got off the school bus. This would mean you're home every evening, every school performance, every science project. Something moved through him at that, not a simple thing, not clean, but real. I'd want to think about it, he said. Of course, she said. A week. Take whatever time you need. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why did you tell me personally before Rice handled the whole thing? She considered this. Because you came back to the building the morning after the garage, she said. When you didn't have to. You fixed the elevator. You started a 12-day watch on your own time and your own judgment, because you'd read the situation correctly and you understood that it wasn't finished. She paused. You did that for me, or at least partly for me. I wanted to offer this to you, not have it delivered. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. 1 week. He took the week. It was not a comfortable week. He'd known it wouldn't be. The question of who he was allowed to be had been one he'd been carrying for 4 years with the specific, exhausting vigilance of a person who doesn't entirely trust their own instincts. He'd made a decision after his wife died, after the fog of that first year had thinned enough that he could think sequentially about the future, that the most important thing he could give Piper was consistency. A father who was the same person every day. Not a person being held in check by discipline alone, but someone who had genuinely chosen a quieter shape of life and could sustain it. The night shift maintenance job had been that choice, made concrete. It was physical. It was routine. It was honest work. And it kept him home for the part of the day that mattered most. The 4 years had been good years, mostly. Piper was healthy and doing well in school, and had strong opinions about pasta and climbing trees, and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn patience. That was not a small thing. That was in fact everything. But he'd been lying to himself about one part of it. He recognized it clearly now, in the way you recognize things clearly, once the circumstances have stripped away the comfortable fog you'd been maintaining. He'd told himself that staying away from the work was about protecting Piper. And it was, genuinely. But underneath that was something else, a fear that if he went back to it, he'd find out that it was still the only place he felt fully competent. That he'd discover, in the plainest possible terms, that he was better at keeping people alive in dangerous situations than he was at the ordinary, unglamorous business of being a father and a person. He wasn't afraid of the danger. He'd never been particularly afraid of that. He was afraid of finding out what it meant that he was good at it. He sat in his backyard on a Saturday afternoon, while Piper was up in the oak tree with a book she'd taken to reading up there, which he'd decided was fine as long as she kept one hand on the branch, compromise they'd reached through negotiation, and he thought about Tessa's offer with the particular thoroughness he gave things that required a real answer. What she was asking him to do wasn't the same thing as what he'd done for 12 years. She was right about that. The Navy had trained him to move toward violence when necessary, and to make his peace with the cost of that. What she was describing was something different, using the analytical skills, the pattern recognition, the ability to read a system and find its failure points to prevent the situations that would otherwise require the response. Prevention rather than response, architecture rather than demolition. He'd spent 4 years maintaining a building. He understood the difference between patching a leak and fixing the condition that caused it. "Dad," Piper called from the tree. "Yeah. If someone offered you a job that was better but you were scared of it, would you take it?" He looked up at her. She was sitting in the fork of the second major branch, 12 feet off the ground, with her book open on her knee and her hair coming out of her braid in the way it always did by afternoon. "Why are you asking that?" "Because you've been sitting there for an hour and you keep making the face you make when you're trying to decide something." "What face?" "The one where your jaw goes tight on the left side," she said. "It always goes tight on the left side." He consciously relaxed his jaw. "It depends on what you're scared of," he said. "If you're scared because the thing is actually dangerous and you have good reasons to avoid it, you probably shouldn't take it. If you're scared because you're not sure you deserve it, that's a different problem." She appeared to think about this with genuine seriousness. "Which one are you?" He looked at her for a moment. 12 feet up in an oak tree, sensible enough to keep one hand on the branch, asking him the precise right question without fully knowing she was asking it. "The second one," he said. She nodded, the way she nodded when adults confirmed things she'd already suspected. "Then you should probably take it," she said, and went back to her book. "Called Tessa that evening." She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been expecting the call. "Reid," she said. "I'll take it," he said, "with one condition." A brief pause. "What condition? If it starts to become something it isn't supposed to be, if the mandate creeps into territory that's more about response than prevention, or if the board starts using the division as something other than what you described, I need the authority to say so and have it taken seriously." "I already told you that. I know. I need you to say it again." She was quiet for a moment, and then, "If you tell me there's a problem, we treat it as a problem. It doesn't expire." "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He started the following Monday. The first weeks were an education in the gap between what a company thinks its risk profile looks like and what it actually looks like. Reid walked every floor of every Marlowe infrastructure property in the city. He spent time with the existing security team, 4 people of varying experience levels, 2 of whom were genuinely good, and 2 of whom had spent years in a role that had never required them to think proactively about anything. He reviewed the building's systems with the specific attention of someone who knew exactly which failure points Graham's team had exploited, and which ones they'd never gotten to. He wrote a 30-page assessment in his 3rd week. It was not a sophisticated document in its presentation. He'd never been a man who spent a lot of time on the packaging of information, but it was specific and sequential, and it identified 23 distinct vulnerabilities across the companies. Physical infrastructure that he could demonstrate, with examples, had the potential to be exploited in ways similar to or worse than what had just occurred. Tessa read it in a day and sent it to the board. The board was impressed, which he registered without particular feeling. He wasn't doing it to impress the board. He hired 2 people in his 5th week, a former Army intelligence analyst named Marcus Webb, who had spent identifying systemic vulnerabilities in logistics networks before deciding he'd rather live in Chicago than wherever the Army needed him next, and a woman named Diane Cho, who had a background in physical security architecture and a reputation for finding the things that weren't obvious. They were both younger than him by about 10 years, both extremely good at their jobs, and neither of them required managing in the traditional sense. They required direction and then room to work. He gave them both. The days were different. He noticed this gradually, and then all at once, the way you notice most things that change slowly. He was home by 5:30 most evenings. Piper was doing her homework at the kitchen table when he got there, and he made dinner not always well, but consistently, and they ate together, and she told him about her day in the particular sprawling, non-linear way that children recount events, where the important thing and the trivial thing receive equal narrative weight, and you have to pay attention to figure out which is which. He started sleeping better. Not perfectly, there were still nights when old machinery ran without his consent. Old operational sequences that played out behind his eyes in the small hours and left him sitting up in the dark with the particular wired alertness of a brain that had been trained to treat certain kinds of sleep as a luxury. But those nights became less frequent. The days gave him something to come home from, which turned out to make a difference he hadn't fully anticipated. 6 weeks after he started, Tessa knocked on the door of his new office, a real office, on level 8. With a window that looked out at the west side of the city and leaned against the doorframe in a way that was somehow similar to the way Piper leaned against doorframes, which he noticed and did not say. "You have a minute?" she said. "Yes." She came in and sat across from him. Not the way she'd sat in the maintenance office, the workbench, the informal perch of someone who is figuring out which version of a conversation to have butt in the chair across the desk, like a peer. "The board met yesterday," she said, "about the restructuring. Graham's departure created several operational gaps. COO position, 2 senior director roles." She paused. "They're going to take several months to fill properly, which means I'm managing a larger operational load while the searches run." "That's a lot to carry," he said. "I've carried more," she said, and there was no complaint in it. "Part I wanted to tell you is that the board also voted to expand your division's mandate and budget. What you identified in the assessment they wanted addressed properly, not incrementally." He nodded. "That's good. It's good," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment in a way that had something else in it, something that wasn't about the board or the budget. "What?" he said. "Nothing official," she said. Just she paused, and he could see her doing the thing she did when she was being precise about what she was actually trying to say. "I had dinner last week with Piper." He waited. "We're at the site inspection in Oak Park. She texted me. I didn't fully realize she had my number until she used it, and asked if I wanted to come over and help her with her science project, because you wouldn't be home until 7. She looked at him. "I hope that's all right. I should have checked with you first." "What was the science project?" "Density and buoyancy. We spent an hour dropping things in a bowl of water and recording the results." A pause. "She's very thorough. She wanted a full data set before she'd accept any conclusions." He smiled, which happened more easily these days than he'd been accustomed to. "That sounds right." "She asked me about my work," Tessa said. "I explained what I do in about as simple terms as I could, and she listened very carefully and then said, 'So you're like the person who decides what buildings get built?' And I said, 'Essentially, yes.' And she said, 'My dad fixes the buildings after they're built. That's probably more important, because you can build a bad one, but you can't really unbuild it.'" He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the performance of amusement. "She's not wrong," he said. "No," Tessa said, "she isn't." She looked at him. "She also asked me at the end of the evening, when she was clearly trying to be subtle about something, which she is not yet very good at, whether I was going to come back." He looked at her steadily. "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd like to," Tessa said, "if that was all right." The office was quiet. Outside the window, the west side of Chicago moved through the middle of a February afternoon, the particular gray and functional beauty of a Midwestern city in winter, unglamorous and real, not trying to be anything other than what it was. "It's all right," he said. She nodded. She stood to leave, and then she stopped with her hand on the back of the chair. "One more thing," she said. "Okay. The ham and mustard sandwiches," she said. Piper mentioned this is a recurring theme. She said you've been eating them every day since she started making them at age 7. "She worries I don't eat properly," he said. "Do you like ham and mustard?" Paused. Genuinely considered it. "Not especially," he said. Tessa looked at him for a moment with the expression she had when something arrived unexpectedly and landed in a place she hadn't been defending. "That might be the most human thing you've ever told me," she said. She left him with that. He sat in his office and looked out at the city and thought about the gap between the life you build to protect yourself and the life you actually want, and how sometimes they look identical for long enough that you stop checking whether they still match. He thought about a 9-year-old who made ham sandwiches out of love and a father who ate them out of the same reason, neither of them saying the obvious thing because the obvious thing didn't need saying. He thought about a woman who had spent a career surrounded by people paid to be loyal and had apparently found it notable when someone was loyal for a different reason. He thought about the oak tree in the backyard and the slow leak he'd finally fixed, and the way some things stop dripping once you decide to stop living around them. He had a meeting at 4 o'clock with Marcus and Diane about the Level 3 camera upgrade. He had a site inspection scheduled for Thursday. He had a division to run and a building to understand and a daughter who was going to need help with the next science project. And for the first time in 4 years, the life that was scheduled in front of him and the life he actually wanted to be living occupied roughly the same space. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was. But it was real, and it was his, and he was done treating those things as though they were less than enough. The trial date was set for the 3rd week of April. Reid knew this the way he knew most things that happened inside the legal machinery surrounding Graham Valor's arrest, not through official channels, not because anyone briefed him, but because he paid attention to the things moving around him and the people who carried information without realizing they were carrying it. The building's legal team occupied most of Level 11, and sound traveled through the HVAC returns in ways that the building's architects had never considered a liability. He wasn't listening deliberately. He just didn't stop listening when relevant things passed through. The months between the gala and April had a particular texture to them, not quiet exactly, but operational in a way that felt sustainable rather than urgent. The investigation had moved through its phases with the methodical patience of institutional process, forensic accounting teams, deposition, document review, slow assembly of a case that Tessa had begun building 3 weeks before anyone else in the building knew there was a problem. Graham had maintained his composure through the early proceedings, with the dignity of a man who understood that a certain bearing, maintained consistently, was itself a form of argument. His lawyers were excellent, and they used that bearing well. But the documents were the documents. Tessa had been thorough. The external audit firm, once given full access, had found not 9 figures of diverted funds, but closer to 11, a number that changed the legal category of the offense in ways that Graham's composure could not absorb entirely. Kyle Marsh had accepted a plea arrangement in February. The IT contacted a man named Frank Delacroix, who had been with the company 6 years and had apparently needed the money for reasons that came out in discovery and were deeply ordinary in their sadness, had also cooperated. Sandra from Event Logistics had turned out to be a probable rather than a certainty. The investigation found her involvement peripheral enough that she was not charged, though she resigned in the 3rd week of January without being asked. Reid had not attended any of the legal proceedings. He'd given his full account to the investigators in December and answered every follow-up question that came through Tessa's legal team with the same precise brevity he gave everything. He'd identified what he'd seen, when he'd seen it, and what he'd done. He hadn't editorialized, he hadn't made it a story. It was already a story. He just wasn't the one who needed to tell it. The trial ran for 11 days. Tessa testified on the 4th day. Reid watched none of it, but Piper had discovered the existence of court proceedings. From a classmate whose mother had been following the coverage, and she'd arrived home one Thursday with a series of questions that he answered as plainly as he could. Yes, the man from his company had taken money that wasn't his. Yes, there was a trial to decide what happened next. Yes, Tessa was involved because it was her company. Piper had listened carefully and then said, with the tone of someone reaching a conclusion, "So it's like when Marcus took Evan's lunch money, and Evan had to go tell the principal, even though he didn't want to." Something like that, Reid said. Did Tessa not want to? He thought about Tessa in the stairwell off level 14, saying, "This is my building," saying it with a flatness that was actually a very precise form of fury held in control. She wanted to, he said. She just had to do it the right way. Did she? Yeah, he said. She did. Graham Valor was convicted on all primary counts in the second week of April. The sentencing was scheduled for June. The diverted funds, the portion that could be recovered, which was not all of it, but was most of it, would be returned to the redevelopment project through a civil judgment that the company's legal team had been running parallel to the criminal proceedings since January. It was not a clean resolution in the way that movies resolve things, where a verdict arrives and the credits roll and the surviving characters walk into some metaphorical light. There were years of legal aftermath still ahead, appeals that Graham's team had already indicated they intended to pursue, civil litigation from project partners who'd been downstream of the diverted funds, insurance claims and board governance reviews, and the long administrative work of rebuilding the internal trust structures that 14 months of quiet theft had hollowed out. Tessa had told Reid once, in a moment of genuinely unguarded honesty, that the hardest part wasn't the money. The money is recoverable, she'd said. They'd been in his office on level 8, late on a Tuesday in March, and she'd been going through a set of contractor assessment documents, while he worked through an updated security protocol, and the conversation had arrived sideways the way honest conversations sometimes do. The money is a number. You fix it by finding the number and putting it back. What's harder is looking at the people who worked with Graham for years, who respected him, who went to him for advice, who took his recommendations and trusted his judgment, and knowing that something true about all of them has changed. They know now that they didn't see it, and knowing that you didn't see something is different from not having seen it. It doesn't mean their judgment was wrong, he'd said. He was convincing. He was, she said. That's almost the harder part. If he'd been obviously bad at it, you could file it under a mistake and move on. But he was good at it for 11 years, which means everything those 11 years produced has to be re-examined. Every decision he influenced, every person he recommended or didn't recommend, every piece of strategy that passed through him. She paused. Can't unexamine that. You live with it. He'd looked at her across the desk, the stacked files, the coffee cup she'd had since morning and kept not finishing, the reading glasses she'd recently admitted she needed, and was still slightly self-conscious about, and he'd thought about what it cost to run towards something you'd built and defend it the way she had. And to come out the other side still standing in it, still responsible for it, still choosing it every morning. You should be proud of what you did, he'd said. Not performed proud. Actually proud. She'd looked at him with the expression she had when something landed somewhere she hadn't been expecting. I'll work on it, she'd said, and went back to the contractor documents. Spring arrived the way it arrives in Chicago, grudgingly in fits, with cold reversals that reminded you the city reserved the right to change its mind. The lake effect kept March raw longer than anywhere else seemed to manage, and April's warmth came in inconsistent parcels between gray stretches that felt like February's last argument. But by mid-May, the trees on the Bridgeport Street had gone fully green, and Piper had declared that the oak tree in the backyard was now in its best climbing condition of the year, and Reid had sat on the back step on a Saturday morning with coffee that had gone lukewarm while she narrated her ascent from somewhere in the upper branches, like a field correspondent reporting from a significant height. As Tessa had been over for dinner 3 times by then. The first time had been arranged with the careful mutual awareness of 2 adults deciding whether to do something that crossed a threshold. Neither had formally acknowledged. The second time had been Piper's doing entirely. She'd called Tessa on a Wednesday and asked if she wanted to come try the pasta, the one with the butter and the cheese, and added as what was clearly meant to be a selling point, he doesn't always burn the butter anymore. The third time had not been arranged in advance at all. Tessa had been in the neighborhood for a site visit to a Marlowe project 2 streets over, and she'd texted him, and he'd said, come by, and she had, and they'd eaten leftovers from the previous night and talked for 2 hours, while Piper did her homework at the other end of the table with her headphones on, periodically looking up to check whether the adults were still having a conversation she might want to join. They were becoming something. He knew it. She knew it. Neither of them had said it in the plain, declarative way that would make it official, partly because the plain declarative version of things was not entirely natural to either of them, and partly because what was actually happening between them was more complicated than the plain version would capture anyway. He'd told her on an evening in late April when Piper was at a friend's house, and they'd been sitting on his back step after dinner in the first genuinely warm evening of the season, that he wasn't sure he was built for the things she was describing. "I'm not describing anything," she'd said. She was sitting with her knees up, holding a glass of water she'd chosen over wine, which he'd noticed but not commented on. "You're sitting on my back step in Bridgeport," he said. "That's describing something." She'd looked at the yard for a moment. "I spent a long time," she said, "running a company in a way that required me to be very good at reading situations. Threat assessment, essentially, though I wouldn't have called it that. Understanding what a room wants, what a person needs, where the pressure points are." She paused. "It's useful. It's also isolating, because when you're always the one reading the room, you stop expecting anyone to read you back." He'd been quiet for a moment. "I've been reading you since the garage," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm on your back step." It wasn't a declaration of anything. It was just true. He'd let it sit between them without trying to name it further, and she'd done the same. And the evening had continued in a way that felt like something being built rather than something being decided. The thing was, he'd been afraid of it. He was still afraid of it. In the specific way he was afraid of things that he wanted, not the operational fear of a situation with physical stakes, which he knew how to manage, but the quieter, more persistent fear of loss. He'd lost his wife at 33. He'd watched the person who knew him best in the world become absent from the world with no warning and no negotiation and no chance to prepare Piper or himself for what that absence would weigh. 4 years later, he still sometimes reached for a kind of permission from that lost permission to keep his perimeter tight, to stay in the radius of the life that was already established and already survivable. But survivable was not the same as lived. He knew that. He'd known it for a while. In the theoretical way, you know things before the right circumstances make them actual. Piper had told him which one he was. Sitting in the oak tree on a Saturday with a book on her knee, and she'd been right, the way she was right, about the things she hadn't fully reasoned through, but understood nonetheless. He wasn't afraid that Tessa was wrong for him. He was afraid that he'd built so much competence around loss that he'd forgotten how to be fully present for something that might not leave. In June, on a Friday evening, he drove to Tessa's apartment for the first time. She lived in Lincoln Park, on the 4th floor of a building that was nothing like what he'd have predicted from the profile of a 30-year-old CEO, not a showplace, not particularly large, with a view of the street rather than the lake and a kitchen that showed evidence of infrequent but enthusiastic use and 2 walls of books that hadn't been organized by any system he could identify. She'd ordered food from the Thai place 2 blocks away, and it was spread across her kitchen table when he arrived, still in the paper containers, and they ate standing up because the table was covered with the books she'd apparently been in the middle of reorganizing and had not reorganized. "You could move the books," he said. "I've been saying that for 3 weeks," she said. "I keep getting interested in one and reading for a while, and then putting it somewhere that's not where it started." "What are you reading?" "Currently 4 things," she said. "None of them finished. That's a lot to carry at once." She looked at him. "That's a fairly direct assessment of my reading habits." "It's a direct assessment of your attention," he said, "which is not a criticism. You do the same thing with problems. You open several and work on all of them at once, rather than completing each before starting the next." Quiet for a moment. "Is that how you see it?" "It's how it works," he said. "It's efficient. Things that need time to develop get that time while other things are being worked." She tilted her head slightly. "You've been thinking about how I work." "I pay attention," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said. They ate the Thai food standing up, which turned out to be fine, and afterward she showed him the books on the wall with the same slight self-consciousness with which she'd admitted to the reading glasses, as though she'd decided to let him see something she wasn't entirely sure she wanted assessed, and he looked at them with genuine interest and pulled out 3 he'd read and 2 he hadn't, and the conversation moved. The way conversations move when 2 people are discovering that their interior landscapes have more overlap than the surface features of their lives would suggest. It was late when he left. She walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the doorway, in the way that moments in doorways sometimes hold themselves, aware of their own significance. "This is going somewhere," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without a lot of scaffolding around it. "Yes," she said. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't scare me." "I know," she said. "I'm not pretending either." He nodded once. He thought about saying something else and decided that what had been said was sufficient. He walked down the hall toward the elevator. "Read," she said. He turned. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm a better reader of rooms than almost anyone I know. And I'm telling you, this is not a room you should be afraid of." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it harder." She almost smiled. He took the elevator down. He thought about what she'd said the whole drive home. Thought about it in the particular way. He thought about things that had landed precisely, not turning them over to find a different angle, but just holding them for a while, the way you hold something that has the right weight. She was right. He knew she was right. The fear wasn't about her. It was about him, about the part of himself that had learned to interpret survival as its own reward, and had gotten very comfortable there. He'd survived his wife's death. He'd survived the transition out of the military. He'd survived 4 years of a life that was smaller than he was, managed it carefully, kept it intact. He'd gotten good at surviving, and somewhere in getting good at it, he'd let surviving become the goal rather than the floor. Piper had not done that. He saw it clearly now, in the way that parents sometimes see their children's natures more clearly than their own. Piper had lost her mother, and she'd mourned her, still did, in the quiet way that children mourn when they're old enough to understand permanence, but young enough that grief is integrated rather than isolated, and then she'd kept growing toward things. Oak tree, the science projects, the ham sandwiches she made for him, because she'd decided at age 7 that love was most practically expressed as feeding someone you cared about. She hadn't built a perimeter. She just kept being present. He'd been trying to teach her. She'd been teaching him. The lakeside cabin had been Tessa's idea, offered in July as a suggestion so casual it took him 3 days to understand it wasn't casual at all. A colleague had a property in Wisconsin, on a lake an hour and a half north of the city, nothing elaborate, 3 bedrooms, a dock, fishing access. Did Piper like fishing? Reid had said he honestly didn't know. They'd never tried. Tessa had said, well, then we'll find out. They drove up on a Friday afternoon in early August, the 3 of them in Tessa's car because it had more trunk space than his truck and Piper had, in preparation for a trip she'd never taken. Developed strong opinions about how much equipment a first fishing expedition required. The drive took almost 2 hours because of construction outside the city, and Piper spent the first 40 minutes managing a spirited debate with Tessa about whether audiobooks counted as reading, a debate which Tessa won on points, but Piper declined to concede, and the second 40 minutes asleep against the window with her mouth slightly open in the way she'd slept since she was a baby, entirely committed to unconsciousness. Reid drove. Tessa sat in the passenger seat in the particular quiet of someone who has figured out how to be comfortable in silence with another person, which is not a small thing and takes longer than most people admit. She went out fast, Tessa said, keeping her voice low. She always does when she's been talking a lot, he said. It's like the battery drains. She almost had me on the audiobook argument, Tessa said. She cited the author's intent. She said an author intends their work to be received, not specifically to be read with the eyes. That's actually a defensible position. I know. It's why I had to pivot to the attention fragmentation argument. She paused. She's going to be formidable. She already is, he said. Tessa looked out at the highway. She has your patience, she said. The way she listens before she responds. She doesn't perform listening the way most people do. She actually does it. He was quiet for a moment. She has her mother's eyes, he said. The listening is something she worked out on her own. Tessa didn't say anything immediately. She had learned he'd noticed this over the months, the particular attentiveness she brought to the spaces where his wife existed in conversation, the ways she didn't fill them or redirect them to let those moments be what they were. What was she like? Tessa said after a moment. She'd never asked directly before. It was the kind of question that requires a specific kind of trust to ask. He thought about how to answer it honestly. She was funny, he said. Not in an obvious way, in a dry observational way that caught you off guard. She could make me laugh in the middle of an argument, which was infuriating, and also one of the things I loved most about her. He paused. She was also stubborn in ways that occasionally made things very difficult. She had strong opinions about how things should be done, and not a lot of patience for doing them differently. Another pause. She would have been a good person to know. Not easy, but good. Tessa nodded. Piper has that too, she said, the strong opinions. Yes, he said. They drove in silence for a few miles. The highway opened up north of the construction zone, and the landscape changed less city density, more tree line, the particular widening that happens when you get far enough from Chicago that it stops organizing the horizon. I don't want you to feel like you have to put her somewhere separate, Tessa said. Your wife. I'm not asking you to keep her out of this. He looked at the road. I know, he said. I mean it specifically, she said. Not as a generous gesture, as something I actually believe. Piper came from her. You came from the years you had together. I'm not interested in a version of you with those things extracted. He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. You're a better person than you generally let people know, he said. I let specific people know, she said. The cabin was smaller than he'd expected, and more comfortable than the size suggested good bones, a stone fireplace that they wouldn't need in August, but that he cataloged for future reference. A dock that extended 20 feet over the lake, with a small aluminum fishing boat tied to the end of it. The lake was narrow and long, pine-lined on both shores, the kind of lake that looks private even when it isn't because the trees do the work of enclosure. Piper woke up when the car stopped and was on the dock within 10 minutes of arrival, having somehow identified the fishing rods in the trunk and located the tackle box before Reid had finished carrying in the bags. Do we have bait? She asked. I'll dig some worms in the morning, he said. Is that how you get bait? You just dig? Generally. That seems like a lot of work for a worm, she said, peering into the tackle box with the focused air of someone conducting an inventory. Most worthwhile things are, he said. Tessa came and stood beside him on the dock, and they both looked at Piper cataloging the tackle box in the late afternoon light. The lake was very still. A heron stood motionless in the shallows 20 yards to the left, operating on its own timetable entirely. This is nice, Tessa said. She said it simply, without performance, the way she said things when she wasn't being Tessa Marlowe, the CEO, and was just being Tessa. Yeah, he said, it is. They stayed 3 nights. Reid dug worms the first morning, and Piper declared the process both disgusting and fascinating, which was an accurate description. They fished off the dock for 2 hours, and Piper caught a small bass that she held up for documentation purposes and then carefully released, because she'd decided before the trip that catching and releasing was morally superior, and she intended to be consistent about her positions. Tessa, who had not fished since childhood, caught nothing but sat in the boat with a rod in the water, and the particular relaxed quality of someone who is doing a thing for no productive reason and finding it unexpectedly restorative. On the second evening after dinner, Piper went inside to read, and Reid and Tessa sat on the dock with their feet off the edge over the water as the light went down. The sky held color longer than the city ever let you see the gradient from orange through rose, through the particular deep blue that arrives before full dark, without any building or streetlight competing with it. Graham's sentencing is next month, Tessa said. I know. The appeals will run for a year, probably, maybe 2. She paused. I've been thinking about what it means when something is finished. The legal definition of finished is different from the actual definition. The legal definition closes the file, he said. The actual definition is when you stop carrying it. I'm not sure I'll entirely stop carrying it, she said. He was part of how the company became what it is. That doesn't just separate out cleanly. No, he said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. I spent a long time after the gala wondering if I should have seen it sooner. Run the numbers differently. Asked different questions earlier. She looked at the water. I've mostly stopped doing that, but it still comes up. You saw it when you saw it, he said. And when you did, you didn't look away from it. That's the part that matters. She looked at him. You really believe that? I really believe that, he said. I've known people who saw things and looked away. That's the version that costs you later. You didn't do that. She held his gaze for a moment in the near dark, and something in her expression shifted not dramatically, not in any way that a camera would have captured, but in the small interior way that people shift when they've been carrying something, and someone has said the right thing at the right moment. I know I'm not easy, she said. Nobody worth knowing is, he said. I work too much. I go quiet when I'm processing instead of communicating. I have opinions about things that I'm not always diplomatic about having. She paused. And I kept waiting for you to find those things inconvenient enough to minus. Tessa, he said. She stopped. I spent 12 years in situations where I had to read people very quickly and very accurately, he said. I know who you are. I've known for a while. He paused. None of it's inconvenient. It's just you. She looked at the water again. Okay, she said. Then, after a moment, I love you. I should probably say that plainly, since I've been saying it in every other form for several months. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just letting it arrive the way it deserved to arrive. I love you too, he said. I've been working up to saying it in that form. How long have you been working up to it? He considered. Since the backstep in April, probably. That's a long time to work up to something. I'm careful, he said. I know, she said. It's one of the things. They sat on the dock until full dark and then went inside, and the night was ordinary, in all the ways that the best nights are ordinary, no crisis, no resolution. Just the accumulated small facts of people being present with each other, without anything required of them. On the last morning, while Reid was making breakfast eggs this time, because there was enough time, Piper came downstairs with something in her hand. A small piece of paper, folded in half, the kind torn from the notepad on the kitchen counter. She went to Tessa, who was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and the document she'd been reviewing the day before because Tessa was constitutionally incapable of a full weekend without reading something work-related, and she put the paper on the table in front of her. Tessa looked at her. Piper's expression was the studied neutral of someone attempting to appear as though they hadn't spent considerable effort on a thing. Tessa unfolded the paper. She read it. She looked up at Piper, then across the kitchen at Reid, who was watching from the stove. He could see from across the room what was on the paper, in Piper's careful, deliberate handwriting, the handwriting of a kid who'd been told by her teacher that she needed to slow down and form her letters properly and had taken this seriously. Are you staying with us for good? Tessa looked at Reid. He looked back at her. He put down the spatula and walked across the kitchen, and she handed him the note, and he read it, though he already knew what it said, and then he looked at Piper. You've been sitting on this one for a while, he said. Piper lifted one shoulder. I wanted to pick the right time. He crouched down to her level, which he'd been doing since she was small enough that it was necessary and had never stopped doing, because she'd indicated, in her way, that she preferred it when he was talking about something real. What do you want the answer to be? He said. She met his eyes with the directness that was entirely her own. I want it to be yes, she said, but I want it to be true. Not just because I asked. He nodded. He stood back up and looked at Tessa. She wants it to be true, he said. Tessa looked at Piper for a moment with an expression he'd seen in pieces, but not fully assembled until now, something that was neither the CEO composure nor the careful guard she kept in professional settings, but something simpler and less defended than either. I'm not going anywhere, she said to Piper, if that's what you're asking. Piper appeared to evaluate this against her internal criteria. Okay, she said. Good. And then, with the characteristic pivot of a 9-year-old whose emotional business has been concluded, is breakfast almost done? Because I want to try to catch one more fish before we leave. 5 minutes, Reid said. Okay. She went out to the dock. Reid looked at Tessa across the kitchen. She's going to be formidable, he said, using her word. She already is, Tessa said, using his. They ate breakfast. They fished for an hour. Piper did not catch anything, but stood the entire time at the end of the dock, with the absolute patience of someone who has decided that a thing is worth waiting for regardless of outcome, and then they loaded the car and drove back to the city. 10 months later, on a Saturday in early June, Reid and Tessa were married at that same lake. Not at a venue on the lake, not at a resort or a rented property nearby. At the same cabin, on the same dock, in the early morning before the heat came, with the lake still and the pines doing what pines do in June, which is hold the light in a way that makes it look like it has weight. There were 14 people. Tessa's 2 closest friends from before the company years, a college roommate who'd flown in from Portland, Reid's sister and her husband from Cleveland, Marcus and Diane from the security division, Reid's former Navy colleague who'd driven 12 hours because he said he'd walk 12 if he had to, Detective Brower, who'd been invited on an impulse of Tessa's and had shown up in a slightly too formal suit and seemed genuinely moved by the whole thing, and Piper, who stood between them at the end of the dock in a dress she'd selected herself after long deliberation, and had then immediately gotten a small grass stain on while inspecting the shoreline, and who held Reid's left hand on one side and Tessa's right hand on the other, and who cried during the vows in the way that children cry at things they feel deeply openly, without embarrassment, and then done. There was no elaborate ceremony. Reid and Tessa had both been clear about that. They'd each written a few sentences that they'd each read aloud in front of the 14 people in the still lake and the morning air. And the sentences were not eloquent in the way that prepared remarks are eloquent. They were honest, which is harder. Reid said, "I spent a long time being good at survival and mistaking it for a life. You didn't let me mistake it. You saw what I was doing and you sat on my back step anyway, and that changed the math in a way I didn't know was possible. I'm not an easy person. I know that. But I'll spend whatever time we have paying attention to you the way you deserve, and making sure you know what you're worth to us." Tessa said, "I built something I'm proud of, and it almost cost me everything that actually mattered, and I wouldn't have known that without you. You taught me the difference between being surrounded by people and not being alone. Piper taught me the difference between being liked and being trusted. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve both of those things." Piper, who had not been asked to speak, said, "Can I say something?" Reid looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "Go ahead." She looked at the lake for a moment with the expression of someone locating the right words in the right order. Then she said, "I think my mom would have liked Tessa. Not because she's nice, because she's not always nice. Because she's real. And I think she would have said, 'You should do this.'" She paused. "Okay, that's all." Nobody said anything for a moment. Brower, in the slightly too formal suit, cleared his throat. Marcus looked at the tree line. Diane, who had presented herself over 6 months of working with Reid as someone for whom sentiment was a professional liability, was very carefully looking somewhere other than at the dock. Reid looked at his daughter. He thought about the baby monitor he still hadn't put away, and the ham sandwiches, and the oak tree, and Saturday morning when she'd told him from 12 feet up which kind of afraid he was. He thought about how a 9-year-old who lost her mother at 5 had managed, through some combination of character and stubbornness, and the particular grace that children sometimes have before the world convinces them out of it, to grow toward life rather than away from it. He had been trying to protect her, but she had also been protecting him from the slow, comfortable diminishment of a life lived only within safe distance of loss. Reception, if you could call it that, was grilled food on the dock and the porch, and someone had brought a speaker, and the music was whatever Piper wanted, which meant it was eclectic in the way of a 9-year-old's taste pop songs she'd heard at school. One of Reid's old Navy colleagues' country requests that got vetoed after one play, and eventually just the sound of the lake in the late afternoon, which was better than any of it. The last real light found them on the dock again, Reid and Tessa. Alone this time, Piper inside asleep on the couch, the 14 guests dispersed to their various cars and drives and flights home. The same dock, the same lake, the same particular stillness of a summer evening up the shoreline when the day has run its full length and is setting down. Next year, Tessa said, "Piper wants to come back and catch an actual fish." "She'll catch one," he said. "You're very confident in her." "She's very patient," he said. "Patient people catch fish eventually." She was quiet for a moment. "What does this feel like?" she said. "Right now. What's the actual honest answer?" He thought about it. Not to perform consideration, but because he wanted to answer it precisely. "Like the leak under the sink," he said, after I fixed it. The absence of a sound you'd been living around for so long that you stopped noticing it. And then it's gone. And you notice the silence, and you realize that you'd been tensed against it the whole time. She looked at him. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me," she said. "And it's about plumbing. I'm a practical person," he said. "I know," she said. "I love that about you. Specifically." He looked at the lake. The heron was back, or a different heron, indistinguishable from the first standing in the shallows with its ancient patience, doing what it did without any awareness of being watched. Here's what was true. The legal proceedings would continue for another 18 months, before they were finally completely done. Graham Valor would serve his sentence, and the money would be largely recovered, and the project partners downstream would reach settlements, and Marlowe Infrastructure would rebuild its governance structures and emerge from the process with the particular hard-won solidity of an institution that has been tested and not broken. Tessa would remain CEO and run the company better than before, not in spite of what had happened, but partly because of what it had required of her. Reid would run his division with the same patient attentiveness he'd brought to every building he'd ever worked in, and Marcus and Diane would become genuinely excellent at their jobs. And the security program would become something the board pointed to when other companies asked how to think about institutional risk. He would be good at it genuinely, sustainably good at it, and he would also be home by 5:30 most evenings. And dinner would be on the table by 6:30, and it would not always be well made, but it would be consistent. Piper would turn 10 in September, and 11 the following September, and she would remain exactly as formidable as Tessa had predicted, and she would also remain, underneath the formidability, kid who made sandwiches for people she loved and cried openly at weddings and kept one hand on the branch. And on some future Saturday, more than one, the three of them would be back at this dock with fishing rods. And Piper would catch a fish and release it because she was going to be consistent about her positions. And Reid would watch her hold it up for the documentation and then set it carefully back in the water. And he would think about what it means to hold something and then let it go without diminishment. And he would understand that this, too, was something she'd been teaching him. The Heron lifted from the shallows in the last light and crossed the lake in a long, unhurried arc, no urgency to it, no performance. Just the clean fact of something built for exactly this, doing exactly what it was built for. Reid watched it go. He was not the man he'd been in the garage, exactly. He was not the man he'd been in the 12 years before that, and he was not the man he'd been in the 4 careful years between. He was something that had come through all of those, carrying what was worth carrying and setting down what had served its purpose. He was not finished becoming whoever he was going to be. Nobody ever is. But sitting on a dock in early June with his wife beside him and his daughter asleep inside and the lake going dark around them, he understood something that he had been circling for 4 years without quite landing on it, that the bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't in a parking garage in January. It wasn't in 12 years of operational decisions in places that didn't make the news. It was deciding, again and again, in the ordinary, unremarkable dailiness of a life still in progress, to stay present for what was in front of him rather than what was behind. It was choosing to keep building, even knowing what it cost to lose. That was the whole of it. It wasn't a revelation. It was just true. He reached over and took Tessa's hand. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The lake held the last of the light for a long time before it finally let it go.